Faith weakens when knowledge remains confined to the intellect and fails to transform behavior, character, and spiritual orientation, because true belief was never meant to be a collection of facts, but a living force that reshapes the human being from within. When knowledge is treated as information rather than responsibility, it creates an illusion of spiritual strength, while the heart remains unchanged. A person may know what is right and wrong, understand theological concepts, and even speak eloquently about religion, yet if this knowledge does not discipline desires, soften arrogance, restrain harmful impulses, or cultivate humility, it slowly loses its power over the soul. This separation between knowing and doing produces internal contradiction, and contradiction is one of the greatest causes of spiritual weakness. The heart senses inconsistency, and over time it becomes desensitized, no longer responding to reminders with sincerity or urgency. Knowledge that is not practiced begins to weigh heavily on the conscience, and instead of drawing a person closer to God, it can lead to frustration, guilt, or even resentment toward religious expectations. In earlier generations, learning was inseparable from transformation. A small amount of knowledge was accompanied by deep reverence, careful action, and feared accountability. Today, the abundance of information has replaced depth with volume and speed with reflection. People move quickly from one lesson to another without allowing time for self-examination or moral correction, and as a result, the soul remains undisciplined. Faith thrives on congruence when belief, speech, and action align, but it weakens when the tongue affirms what the limbs contradict. This inconsistency gradually erodes certainty because the heart learns to ignore what it claims to believe. Over time, religious language becomes familiar but hollow, rituals become routine without presence, and reminders feel repetitive rather than transformative. The problem is not ignorance but unreconciled knowledge, knowledge that has not been allowed to challenge habits, comfort, and ego. When learning is pursued for identity, debate, or social validation rather than self-rectification, it feeds pride instead of humility, and pride is one of the greatest barriers to faith. A proud heart resists submission, even while outwardly appearing religious. Furthermore, when people do not see knowledge producing ethical refinement in themselves or others, they subconsciously question its effectiveness, leading to doubt not in the truth itself, but in its relevance to real life. This is why faith weakens quietly. It is not attacked from outside, but hollowed out from within. The heart begins to operate independently of belief, making decisions based on desire, fear, or social pressure rather than divine guidance. Eventually, belief becomes symbolic rather than directive, something acknowledged but not obeyed. To restore faith, knowledge must return to its original purpose, to cultivate awareness of God, accountability, and moral responsibility. Learning must be accompanied by action, repentance, patience, and self-discipline, because faith is strengthened when the soul experiences the truth it claims to believe. When a person struggles to live by what they know, even imperfectly, faith grows stronger through sincerity. But when knowledge remains unapplied, it becomes a witness against the self, and the heart, burdened by contradiction, slowly loses its light. Faith weakens profoundly when the heart becomes dominated by materialism. Because the human soul was never designed to find meaning, security, or fulfillment in possessions, status, or constant consumption. When worldly success becomes the primary measure of worth, spiritual values are gradually pushed to the margins, not through deliberate rejection, but through neglect. The modern environment continuously trains people to focus on what is immediate, visible, and measurable, while faith calls the heart toward what is unseen, eternal, and morally demanding. This tension creates an inner imbalance. The more the heart is occupied with accumulation and comparison, the less space it has for remembrance, gratitude, and reliance upon God. Over time, constant exposure to material goals conditions the soul to expect instant results, quick pleasure, and effortless comfort, whereas faith is built through patience, restraint, and trust in outcomes beyond immediate perception. This conditioning weakens spiritual resilience, making belief feel abstract and distant rather than grounding and real. When financial anxiety, social validation and personal ambition dominate thought patterns, the heart begins to measure security through control rather than trust, and this subtly erodes certainty. People begin to believe in God conceptually while relying on wealth, influence, or planning for emotional safety. This divided reliance creates spiritual instability because faith cannot fully settle in a heart that is constantly fearful of loss. Materialism also distorts priorities, causing moral compromises to feel necessary or even justified. When success is defined narrowly, ethical boundaries become flexible, and each small compromise further weakens the authority of faith over decision-making. The heart becomes accustomed to rationalizing disobedience, and rationalization is one of the most effective ways faith is silenced without being denied. Over time, spiritual practices begin to feel burdensome because they interrupt productivity and comfort, rather than being seen as essential nourishment. This leads to a transactional mindset, where worship is valued only if it produces immediate benefit, and when it does not, commitment fades. Faith, however, was never meant to compete with worldly pursuits, it was meant to govern them. When this hierarchy is reversed, belief loses its central role and becomes an accessory rather than a foundation. The heart, overwhelmed by constant desire, loses its sensitivity, and what once inspired awe becomes ordinary. Without conscious detachment, not abandonment of the world, but freedom from enslavement to it, the soul becomes restless, and a restless soul struggles to sustain deep faith. Faith also weakens when spiritual discipline is neglected, because belief without structure gradually dissolves into sentiment rather than conviction. Acts of worship were designed not merely as rituals, but as consistent training that shapes perception, behavior, and inner resilience. When these practices are rushed, postponed, or performed without presence, they lose their transformative effect, leaving the soul spiritually undernourished. Just as the body cannot remain healthy on occasional meals, the heart cannot remain strong on sporadic remembrance. Discipline creates rhythm, and rhythm anchors faith in daily life. Without it, belief becomes reactive, strengthening only during crises and fading during ease. This inconsistency trains the heart to associate faith with desperation rather than purpose. Over time, neglect of spiritual practices weakens the sense of accountability, because reminders of divine awareness are no longer frequent enough to restrain impulses. The ego, left unchallenged, begins to assert dominance, reshaping morality around convenience rather than principle. This leads to gradual desensitization, where actions that once caused discomfort are normalized, and conscience becomes quieter. When conscience is dulled, faith feels weaker, not because it has disappeared, but because its voice is no longer heard. Furthermore, spiritual discipline is essential for cultivating patience and humility, both of which are necessary for sustaining belief during uncertainty. Without regular reflection and self-correction, doubts grow unchecked, and emotional fluctuations begin to dictate belief. A person may still identify as faithful, but their inner state becomes fragile, easily shaken by hardship, criticism, or unanswered questions. Discipline also provides clarity, allowing the believer to distinguish between passing emotions and enduring truths. Without it, feelings are mistaken for faith itself, leading to confusion when emotional highs fade. True faith is not sustained by intensity alone, but by consistency. When acts of worship are treated as optional rather than essential, the soul internalizes the idea that belief itself is optional, something that can be adjusted according to mood or circumstance. This mindset weakens commitment and reduces faith to identity rather than responsibility. To preserve faith, discipline must be restored not as a burden but as mercy, a means of grounding the heart in purpose and reminding the soul of its ultimate direction. Without this structure, faith slowly erodes, not through rebellion, but through forgetfulness. Faith weakens further when the sense of sacred purpose is lost. because belief was never meant to exist in isolation from meaning, direction, and responsibility. Human beings are purpose-driven by nature. When the question of why we exist is left unanswered or treated casually, the soul begins to drift. In such a state, faith is reduced to cultural inheritance or personal identity rather than a guiding force that shapes choices and endurance. When people no longer view their lives as part of a larger moral and spiritual journey, daily actions lose significance, and belief feels disconnected from reality. This disconnection creates an inner emptiness that material success, entertainment, or social validation cannot fill. Without a clear sense of sacred purpose, hardships feel random rather than meaningful, and ease feels undeserved rather than a trust. Faith weakens because it is no longer seen as essential for navigating life, but as an optional supplement. The heart becomes preoccupied with survival, pleasure, or recognition, while the deeper questions of accountability and legacy are postponed or ignored. Over time, this postponement trains the soul to live on the surface of existence, avoiding reflection, stillness, and self-examination. When reflection is avoided, the heart loses awareness of its own condition, and faith diminishes quietly, not through rejection, but through irrelevance. Sacred purpose gives weight to actions, reminding the believer that even small choices are seen, valued, and recorded. When this awareness fades, ethical behavior becomes situational and sincerity weakens because actions are no longer rooted in consciousness of the divine. The soul, deprived of higher meaning, seeks fulfillment in temporary pursuits, but these pursuits exhaust rather than satisfy, leaving the heart spiritually fatigued and vulnerable to doubt. Faith thrives when life is understood as a trust and a test. It weakens when life is treated as ownership and entitlement. Faith is also weakened by the loss of spiritual struggle against the ego because the ego naturally resists submission, patience, and accountability. Without intentional effort to discipline it, the ego gradually becomes the primary decision maker, shaping beliefs to accommodate desire rather than truth. This shift is subtle and often unnoticed. People may still speak the language of faith, but their inner compass is guided by comfort, social acceptance, and self-justification. When the ego dominates, repentance becomes rare because admitting fault threatens self-image. Yet repentance is one of the most powerful means of reviving faith as it restores humility and reconnects the heart to mercy. Without it, the soul hardens, becoming defensive rather than receptive. Spiritual struggle is not about perfection, but about honesty and persistence. When this struggle is abandoned, faith becomes fragile because it is no longer protected from internal erosion. The ego thrives in environments of constant stimulation and distraction where there is little silence or introspection. In such conditions, the heart rarely pauses to question its intentions or realign with higher values. Over time, this leads to moral fatigue, where resisting temptation feels exhausting and unnecessary. Faith then feels demanding rather than liberating, because it is perceived as an external pressure rather than an internal conviction. The loss of struggle also weakens gratitude because the soul begins to feel entitled rather than thankful. Gratitude strengthens faith by acknowledging dependence, while entitlement feeds dissatisfaction and complaint. When gratitude fades, faith loses one of its strongest emotional anchors. Finally, faith weakens when community and transmission of values are weakened because belief was never meant to be sustained in isolation. Human beings are influenced deeply by their environment, and when faith is not reinforced through example, mentorship, and shared practice, it becomes vulnerable to dilution. In many cases, religious teachings are transmitted as rules without wisdom or information without embodiment. When people do not witness faith lived with integrity, compassion, and balance, they struggle to see its relevance and beauty. This leads to disengagement, especially among younger generations who are searching for authenticity rather than mere instruction. Faith is learned not only through words, but through observation of character, resilience, and moral courage. When these examples are absent or inconsistent, belief becomes abstract and uninspiring. Additionally, when communities prioritize appearance over substance or debate over self-rectification, faith becomes associated with conflict rather than guidance. This association creates emotional distance, making belief feel heavy rather than nurturing. A strong community provides support during doubt, accountability during weakness, and encouragement during struggle. Without it, individuals carry the weight of faith alone, and isolation amplifies uncertainty. The weakening of communal bonds also reduces opportunities for collective remembrance, reflection, and service, all of which reinforce belief through shared purpose. When faith is no longer experienced as a lived reality within a supportive environment, it risks becoming a private concept detached from action. To preserve faith, sacred purpose must be